So to open the session today, we have Paivi Abernethy, who is going to be speaking to us about climate change and health. She joins us from Finland. She just informed me she's very close to the Arctic Circle, and we're very excited to have you. When Paivi and I started this conversation, she was still based in Canada, but now she made a move over to Finland. She's going to give you a bit of a bio of herself, but she is an adjunct professor still at University of Victoria and Waterloo, I believe, but you can give us the full update. So over to you, Paivi. Thanks so much for presenting.
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and welcome everyone. I got the honor of talking about the climate change and health related to organic food, and primarily even I'll tell a little bit more about myself in a second. And you can see I'm in a cabin. I'm in quarantine and COVID quarantine here in Finland. I moved from Vancouver Island, lived in Zug, and before I start, I just wanted to highlight or clarify a couple of things. As we all know, but I just want to say climate change is not something that is going to happen to us. It's happening to us very much so, and in particular in Canada. So because despite the fact that I'm in Finland, this focuses a whole lot in Canada, because that's where I've lived for the past 20 years and been working on these topics. And when I'm talking about health and climate change impacts on health, I also want to highlight that I'm talking about planetary health instead of just talking about public health, meaning about 3-4 years ago, scientists and scholars and health professionals came together in Europe and coined this term, because they realize that public health is only talking about human health, but our health is not possible without the health of the rest of the support systems that we have. So I'm also using a term climate health, which was developed in the States as a shortening for the climate change impacts on health. And in my case, I also mean that health is much more than just human health. This is the part about changing the way we think and talk about climate change and health in general. So I just wanted to make sure that we on the same, you understand the terminology that I'm using. So I am a researcher practitioner. So I'm a health professional. I have a master's degree in biochemistry. I worked in life sciences and food industry before. For years, and then went over to public health and got another master's degree in public health, and then worked in children's environmental health and chronic disease prevention. And I wear a lot of hats because then I realized that we're missing this link. So I went and did a PhD in social and ecological sustainability at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And because I work on this interface between between these different factors on health and environment, and in particular food systems, I'm also working in the many different organizations, and I have here a little bit of those hats that I work on. Where I have First Nations Health Authority there. As when we started these conversations, I was actually working as a climate change and health specialist with First Nations Health Authority and Environmental Public Health Services, and as well as I was being a researcher. And I started 1st of November here in Finland, looking at all these things on the rural and agricultural aspects and cumulative impacts, and how we can support sustainable transitions, and in particularly organic agriculture is close to my heart, because I'm actually was discovered as a child allergic to a lot of pesticides. So I ate organic food way before it was a hit. And I'm also in the editorial I've been working with the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems and Community Development as a volunteer and peer reviewer for the last 10 years. And now I'm also in the editorial team there. So that was a long story about that. For the next about half an hour, I'll divide it for three themes. First, I do the climate change impacts on health and the gloom and doom, which I know way too much about and makes me cry if I start talking about it too much. But then also the solutions and holistic perspectives and how we could actually approach it in a better way than what we're doing right now, as well as completing then as how I see, and based on science and my research, the role of organic food and organic food production as one of the great mechanisms of moving forward and finding solutions. And I just want to highlight, for instance, I was running a funding program for community-driven research at the First Nations Health Authority, and over 90%, if 95% of the projects that communities proposed were all related to food, trying to address climate action, climate issues, both action and mitigation and adaptation. So then the fourth part is when we hopefully talk and you can question what I say or ask more questions. So again, where there are a lot of us with different backgrounds, I just want to get us on board on the same starting point. And from health perspectives, there are three aspects of climate change that really are critical for health and how it relates to food systems. And one is the carbon dioxide and the increased levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. As you all know, it's not one of the worst greenhouse gases. Methane is much worse, but from health perspective, it actually is critical because in natural systems, the systems seek a balance. And so in the gas and water interface, when there is more carbon dioxide in the water, that pressures simply more to the water. So when more carbon dioxide is getting into the water, which is happening right now, it causes acidification, which is quite detrimental to all the living species in the water, particularly those that are not like mammals, that because it impacts little changes in pH actually can stop or damage or prevent development of embryos and even the whole reproductive system. And then the second part is the extreme weather conditions. And we just talked about before here is that it's again the balance that the planetary system is trying to find with these new greenhouse gas and temperature balances. So all these crazy weather conditions like snowstorms in Vancouver or Vancouver Island that didn't used to happen as frequently, or the cold and extreme weathers, or the heat waves, or the storms, they are all part of that climate change. So I'm glad that we've moved away from talking about global warming, even though the third part that is relevant for health aspect is the high temperatures, that the climate that is overall increased temperatures, which is really bad for anybody who works in agriculture, for all the, particularly for plants, but as well as for animals that are adapted to living and surviving in certain temperatures. And I'll talk more about these different changes later. But these all are impacting the living conditions of us, people, animals, and plants on this planet, and the forest fires and flooding and so on. And those are then impacting our health short term, those acute impacts, and long term, the chronic impacts. And I will talk more about the long term because that's much more relevant for organic food production. But I want to highlight here about these short-term impacts because those are the ones that we discuss in the conversations in the newspapers and media. And instead of looking at what is causing what, I want to highlight the complexity, because there are two aspects in this. The first of all, we have heat. and high temperatures, it impacts a lot of different health conditions. It could be that there are longer heat waves, so there is pollen season is worse and longer, and so it's impacting people, affecting people who have pulmonary lung conditions. And the same way, things that we don't think about it, the heat is problematic for people with kidney diseases or heart conditions. But at the same time, conditions such as lung conditions and asthma and allergies, they are affected by lots of different climate change impacts. And I have listed here an example of the heat and the forest fires and the poor air quality, but also after flooding, oftentimes there is a lot of mold in particularly buildings that get damaged. So what I'm talking about is that when we talk about climate change impacts on health, and then later more about why it's important about the food security and food production, is that it's very, very complex and there is no silver bullet. And if there is one silver bullet that is close to it, I would say organic production might get close to that, but we'll talk about that a little later. So there are the long-term impacts of climate change on health that are much, much more detrimental in the reality for us and our food system, for food security, food safety. And food safety, I mean toxins, I mean infectious bacterial contaminants, and so on and so forth. And when I put food security is the access to healthy, sustainable, healthy foods, and in and we really are starting to have problems. I'm most familiar with Ontario, where I lived, and particularly in BC, because that's where I worked on this topic for the past many years. And things such as forest fires, we used to think in agriculture, that was actually here in Finland, in some areas, it was very typical that the people moved inland and burned the forest because it was so good to grow food on it. But we are now discovering that with the forest fires as they are now, the forests are not recovering the same way. And it hasn't even been studied what the impacts are of the chemicals that we use um, to stop the fires. But in general, we are having serious problems in recovering with the biodiversity. And then talking about about the grizzly bears, like the berries. The problem right now is the pollinators, and the pollinators and flowers or plants that need the pollination may not be active at the same time, or the berries, as most of the organic farmers know, that it's really hard to actually assess when the berries or the fruits are ripening because the unpredictability of the weather conditions. So these are the things that I just want to highlight. It's very much gloom and doom, but it's important to recognize that that's a reality that we are facing right now. And I'm adding one more slide, and then I go to the solutions. Is the two aspects that I want to highlight about the additional pressures is that when we're thinking about this happening, is that particularly animals and plants, the first one is that it's not one thing happening to them. It's for instance, I'm talking about I worked so much with First Nations, and for them harvesting is a lot about the fish and fisheries and the coastal regions particularly, but the ocean temperature is now already 1 to 2 degrees centigrades higher, so the kelp doesn't grow well in the warm water, so it's moving further up north, and so herring that is needing kelp to lay eggs is moving northwards. So the people who are dependent on that harvesting in those areas are suddenly without fish. And at the same time, the acidification is impacting, and the higher temperatures is impacting the development, the healthy development of of those fish eggs. And the same again, be it farming or fish, when the waterways are drying out, salmon can't go up, or there are toxic blooms and there's contaminant release because of the warmer waters are changing the currents of the waters, and so on and so forth. So it's these many impacts happening to singular species and all at once. And then one of the things that most of you probably are aware of, these two frogs. It's the same. I don't know if it's the same frog, but this is from a published paper from 2007. There is this research group in Berkeley, California, that was studying pesticides, and this study that many of you might know is that because as you heard from the keynote speaker yesterday, the pesticides and chemicals are tested all in isolation, and so they don't do damage to the animals when they are tested, but in nature they are often in these toxic cocktails. So there are multiple different chemicals, and the picture on the right hand side is actually when the frog is tested with the 9 most common chemicals used in North America, pesticides, sorry, used in North America, and it's not killing the frog, and it is not actually making it sick. It's that the chemical cocktail is causing such a pressure on the stress on the immune system that that bacteria that is quite it's everywhere in the nature and is usually very benign, is causing these muscle spasms for the frog. So what I'm highlighting here is that climate change is not happening to a pristine environment. It's causing stress, not just as a climate change, but it's also causing stress with these cumulative impacts on our environment, not just human beings, but particularly to the nature and environment. And that's was the gloom and doom part, because there really is a way that we can start changing how this is. And one of the parts that I have learned with working with First Nations is that it really matters the way we frame our problems and the way we tell our stories. And with the next couple of slides, I'd like to provoke you to think about, what if we started telling our stories slightly differently? And this is really relevant, I think, for the success, a broader success of organic agriculture in particular. Because health, it is an outcome of sustainable, healthy environmental stewardship and food production. And I am highlighting here the path dependencies of how we tell the stories, because at some point, I'm sure you all have seen this. This is like the human-centric, anthropocentric, and ecocentric ways of looking at the world. But for some reason, in industrialization context, we started thinking as a human being as a top of this pyramid, somehow superior to all the other species. But as a biochemist in my training, I see as we are all coded by DNA and endocrine disruptors, as I'm not talking more about that because that was discussed yesterday, but endocrine disruptors impact all living species, with particularly those who are controlled by hormone systems, which is plants and most animals and human beings. And so it is, we human beings are entirely dependent on the biodiversity. We entirely dependent of all the other species to creating this balance so that we can function and survive in this world. And starting to think differently and starting to tell our stories differently really makes a difference. And then also this, somewhere around industrialization, 1930s, when we had the Enlightenment business, where and maybe even earlier, the Cartesian separation, that we separate that the biophysical from ethical and values, and be it spiritual or anything social, uh, is actually has caused a lot of this damage that we're doing. And as Einstein has actually highlighted, is that very often, like actually, we can't, he said that we can't fix the problems we've created with the same mechanisms and tools that created them in the first place. And so I am here um, triggering and inviting you to start thinking, what would it look like if we told our stories differently? And I am not trying, I'm not trying to impose indigenous thinking on anybody, and I'm not trying to steal their thinking. There are different cultures. There are over 200 different communities and cultures, even in British Columbia only. But this particular here, that highlights about how different worldview indigenous cultures often have. This is from a book on Native Americans and climate change, actually an academic book, an introduction to the book by Daniel Wildcat. And he talks about this as what if we start looking at other species through this thing, even just from biology, as relatives, as and if we add to that the stewardship and responsibilities and not just rights, that understand our relationship, treat, instead of ownership, treat our relationships with the surrounding species, how would that impact our our uh, actions in life and how we treat things? If we treated um, sort of um, nature or animals as if they were our family. And what I'm trying to illustrate is in a different way, is that here I'm still speaking as if I was on Vancouver Island, sorry. It's Swinomish Nation is an indigenous nation, first south of the border in the United States, but they're part of the Coast Salish, which is a cultural group of different nations that are from northwest coast of the United States, Washington and Oregon, and then southwest coast of the mainland British Columbia, as well as the little bit of the east, southeast coast and south coast of Vancouver Island. And so about 20 years ago, a toxicologist called Jamie Donatuta went to work with the Swinomish Nation and studying toxicology and public health indicators. And she came to realize that whatever she was monitoring and measuring didn't make any sense for the community. And she started working with an elder, Larry Campbell. And over the last 20 years, they developed first these indigenous determinants of health in collaboration with the community. And these, they have been then used to address climate adaptation and actually even some COVID work. But they went to the community and said, so if this, because when in Western society we talk about health is often physical activity and diets and stuff. So what is it that really makes this community healthy and what matters to you? And the community identified this community connection, self-determination, so social networks, empowerment, balance, community strengths, and education and training, skill building and livelihoods, and natural resource security, which was food security for them. And then their identity and cultural practices, that's what they identified as a measurable things that would make their community healthy, which is sort of embrace this physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional health. And so what I'm trying to say, this is just their community. These are not necessarily even true to the neighboring communities, but I'm trying to highlight this with the thing is, what if we start thinking about what really makes us healthy and start monitoring those things? That maybe not the way we are right now path dependent of thinking of how we should run the business and how we should think about um, addressing climate change and health. And these are not, so for when I'm looking at their organic food production and produce and the organic farmers that I know these same values are very um, resonate with a lot of people, and it's all about sufficient, healthy, sustainable food supplies. And so I'm just triggering you to think about the language that we use when we're telling the stories. Are we talking about utilitarian ecosystem services that we know, which is very much focusing on monetary assessment? I understand the importance of it, but for addressing the challenges that we really are addressing, are we talking about stewardship or services, and or both, or what is the language that we want to use? Or wellness, is it just about producing healthy food, or is it about actually producing much broader healthy ecosystem where we human beings are part of it? And what is health? Is health, because social and ecological determinants of health, we know not just the empowerment aspect. Is like, the funny thing is that the Western science actually has tons of studies summarizing how empowerment is a key and central piece of people being healthy. And if anybody is interested, there is a World Health Organization. Even 2006, there was Nina Wallerstein who summarized did a good literature review that is publicly available. But I'm just saying is that thinking about health and importance and what uh, organic food production really can offer for society. And here's the last piece where I'm tying again back to the First Nations and Indigenous First Native Americans, is that the IPCC report from last June, and that is the International Panel for Climate Change, they concluded that the lands governed by Indigenous people, despite the industrial injustices, it's still significantly healthier and more sustainable than lands governed by non-Indigenous people in general. And I beg to differ in terms of organic farmers, but it's such a small group of small part of our agricultural production yet that that's probably not significant in statistical measures. And I don't know if they were looking at that at all. But my point here is that there are huge opportunities of even for organic farming to actually work together with First Nations and learn from the way and combine and create new alternative ways. I don't know how much you are aware of preventing forest fires by traditional controlled burning, which has been now scientifically studied that, okay, yeah, it works, but they've been doing it for a couple of millennia. It was tested in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Or the agroforestry, the different ways of agriculture that was used, clam gardens, all these things, the diversifying the organic food production in a way that could be part of finding really sustainable solutions. And now I'm taking my last bit of why organic food and agriculture really matters for climate change and health. So this is a very nice picture about food systems in general, but it is still, and I appreciate this picture and the scientific paper where it came from. But because I'm critiquing it, I didn't put the name there right now. If anybody's interested, I can share it with you. But this is again still very human-centered. It focuses on these three arrows here. I think it's the organic aspects so that I was supposed to talk today about climate change and the contaminants. But this is still more of that path that we are trying to fix the world using the same way of thinking that we have done so far. And I am just provoking you to explore new ways of thinking how we can stop thinking of human beings separated from the nature, as part of the nature, as social ecological systems where biophysical and the social are intricately interlinked. And that's where I think organic farming really has an opportunity to play a much stronger role than hitherto has been discussed. And I could talk much longer about this, but I highlighted these 3 areas where I think for this particular topic, there's huge potential. It's the planetary health. Planetary health refers actually to the fact that we have a planet that has some boundaries. So it's not just that we need the health and wealth, healthiness of ecosystem, but it's also that we can only deal with so many chemicals, or we can only dig so many non-renewable resources, and so on and so forth. So organic farming helps staying within those planetary boundaries. There are increased positive cumulative impacts for healthier environments broader than just the agricultural production. And there are reduced negative cumulative impacts. I talk a little bit more about it in the next slide. And then there is this community resiliency, and all these 4 are really central for our ability to deal with the climate change that is already happening, both adaptation and mitigation. And resiliency here refers to that whatever comes to the community, there are enough strengths to be able to deal with it, not necessarily recover entirely to the same what it was, but at least deal and survive and keep the livelihoods and keep people healthy and stay sustainable. And food systems and food security is a central piece in our survival in climate change and resiliency. So here is my, now I can't see everything that I have written here, but it's basically, if we start from very briefly to say, if you don't know, nutrients and toxics follow the same metabolic pathways and they compete. So therefore, there are lots of studies of different aspects, and I could give another talk about that, is how and why, for instance, different vitamin Bs are counteracting even toxics, and considering that organic agriculture avoids and reduces that, it causes even less stress on the system. One aspect also that hasn't been talked about much that I had to highlight, that with the COVID, is that the animal husbandry practices and requirements in organic agriculture are actually can play a significant role in preventing things like COVID happening. Because, and this is a very quick story, I'm working right now with a vet researcher, and Miraziolo, who is talking about how we have a massive issue with factory farming and the stress conditions that our contemporary development is causing for animals. And she uses bats as an example, because bats carry usually average up to 200 different COVID strains and other viruses and bacteria on them. And when they are in the old days, when bats had massive forests to live in, enough space, that was not so much of a problem. But now, as we're cutting into their living spaces, from clear cutting to urban development and to light pollution, it's causing tremendous stress for them. And when they are stressed, the immune system gets compromised, just like that frog that I was talking about. And in those situations, the vets call it shedding the disease, the vectors, because the vectors can be bacteria, that it can be viruses, it can be fungus, it can be different things. But the point is that that's how the transition happens to other species. And that's what we're having. That's a whole different discussion. There was just in Denmark, they had that problem with minks on those big mink farms where there are hundreds of thousands of animals. And now the more, the mutated COVID is getting back to, is discovered in people. So organic farming has huge potential in also preventing this kind of epidemics from happening if we can find ways of getting it more mainstream. So my time is running out, but the positive aspects are here of all these things about the strengthening biodiversity, since it's not killing threatening species through these different chemical exposures. And it's the same strengthening the human, plant, and animal health. It's strengthening ecosystem resiliency through all these different pathways, and community empowerment because it also requires so much more and provides healthy work environments. So here are the different future opportunities that I'm throwing it there for you to start thinking of what does that mean to organic agriculture? How can we change these stories? How can we talk about ecosystem health and stewardship? Is that relevant? Am I entirely wrong about the endocrine disruptors and animal husbandry and all that? So I'm not reading you can read the slides here yourself, but this is where I'm starting the conversation with you of how can organic agriculture actually help us to mitigate the impacts of climate change on health. So thank you.